This edition of the Pest Geek Podcast is brought to you by Pest Routes. Pest Routes, supercharge your company with Pest Routes, the #1 pest control software to help you dominate your goals. Visit them at pestroutes.com and get your free demo.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek Podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek Podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your pest geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube, we're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, giving you an update here on the wildlife. Wanted to talk today a little bit about understanding wildlife law. This is probably one of the bigger issues for pest controllers because it is confusing, and I want to try to unpack some of this for you. Now, of course, we have to throw those traditional caveats out there. That is, hey, you always have to check your particular state, but as a rule, some of these principles will at least help you navigate and understand some of the terminology that may be used in your particular location. So why don't we get started here a little bit? All wildlife, and by wildlife, I'm only going to be referring to vertebrate animals. Now, and this can be confusing as well because, an insect is an animal, right? So but when we're talking about, a lot of these legal protections, it's typically we're talking about, animals, that are vertebrates. And so understand that my conversation with you today is about vertebrate animals and understanding what we would call traditionally wildlife, even though on a biological level, wildlife would include, insects and then other invertebrates and that sort of thing. But I just want to talk today about vertebrate wildlife. So understanding that wildlife is governed, basically falls into two main categories in terms of classifications. And those two umbrella categories are what we call protected species and unprotected species. So let's talk about protected species first. What protected species means is that there are legal protection or legal restrictions or legal governance managing what we can do and not do with certain vertebrate species. Perhaps the easiest one to talk about is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Now, this is an international treaty that's been around since the early 20th century. I think it was 1911, somewhere around there, that America made with Canada and Mexico. Today, we've added in, I believe, Russia is a signatory. I believe Japan's a signatory. But the point is that these are birds that cross international boundaries when they're migrating. And so the countries got together and did a really smart thing, actually. They said, look, we don't want to be, blasting each other's species. We want to protect these animals that cross our international boundaries so that we manage them appropriately so that they don't go extinct and we can continue to harvest them and they have rules governing their control. The point is those birds are protected. Even if you're allowed to shoot them, there are restrictions about when and where and how you can do that. So that's what's called a protected species. So when we talk about a protected species, it doesn't mean you can never kill it or ever harass it or something like that. It means that there are certain rules governing what you can do with that animal. Either it restricts when you can kill it, how you can kill it, how many you can kill. there's rules somewhere. And so the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a federal legislation, federal treaty, international, that trumps any of your state rules. In other words, we're in a federal system here in America, and that's basically, I'm assuming, our audience. I think things are similar in Canada. Don't know enough about Mexico. But when we look at these laws, we have to understand that we're dealing with that whatever the federal government restricts, states and local areas can't make less restrictive. States and local areas can add more rules, but it can never make fewer rules that loosen up the federal guidelines. So think of it like if the federal government creates boundaries, your state law can only make boundaries as restrictive as the federal or more restrictive. It can never make those boundaries less restrictive. The same way with the local government. Local government can never make laws or regulations that are less restrictive than the state government or the federal government, because it just doesn't work that way. So it's always a top-down. You can always make things harder. You can never make things looser the farther down the government ladder you go. So birds, most of your birds are protected species. Why? Because of that Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Now, on the flip side, we have unprotected species. So let's stay on the bird thing just to kind of make things a little bit simpler. There are unprotected birds, and those birds are house sparrows, European starling, pigeon, also known as rock dove, your Eurasian collared dove, those 4 species, and I believe there's one more depending what state you're in, sort of like some of your Muscovy ducks, for instance, are considered non-native species in certain parts of the country. You have to check your local area because they were native in certain parts of the country, or at least they're treated that way. So those 4 species, we're going to leave Muscovy ducks off the table. So those 4 species are not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Why? Well, because they are not native species to North America. That is the pigeon, the European starling, the Eurasian collared dove, and the house sparrow. All 4 of those species are not native to the United States or Canada or Mexico. So, just to throw it out there. So if we say when Columbus came to America, or to the Caribbean, were these birds around? And the answer is no. They were actually introduced at a later date. So they were not native to North America. So therefore, they lie outside of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So there are no federal restrictions on the killing or taking of those birds. Now, just because there's no federal rules doesn't mean that your state, I'm not aware of any state that does restrict the control of those 4 birds, but I do believe there are some local communities, such as New York City, that do restrict certain ways of managing those bird species. And so that is why you have to check in some of those more progressive, liberal areas where they don't understand nature as well as other parts of the country, where they may have additional rules governing the restricting the control of those particular species. And that's why you have to kind of know your local area. But on the federal level, you can blast them all day long. And I'm not aware of any state that has additional rules on those birds. But there are some, I am aware of some local areas that will have some. But this is why you have to know your area. But the point is that you have protected species, unprotected species. So let's flip now over to some other animals just to kind of unpack this a little bit more on the protected species side. So again, just to reiterate, protected species means that there are rules governing the taking of that particular species of animal. But you may say, well, I'm blasting squirrels, or I'm able to go hunting every year and take deer. Yes, those are protected because you can't do it year round under certain hunting licenses. So let's break down what some of those protected species. Here's some words here that you might know when you're reading the law. We have categories of protected species. One of them is what's called a fur bearer. Now, here's where it gets confusing, because all mammals have fur. But that's not what they mean when you read something in your game laws for your state. When they use the word fur bearer, they're referring to a classification of animals that are traditionally harvested for their pelt. So deer, for instance, deer are mammals and they have fur, but people have not traditionally trapped them for their fur. Mink, that's a different story. Mink have been harvested for their fur because they have a very fine fur. So fur bearers are often governed by fur bearer rules. Now, fur bearers are often animals that can be trapped, and in some cases, trapped and hunted. So trapping, of course, that should be pretty certain. That's the setting of a device that captures an animal, whether by an extremity, a limb, or whether it envelops the animal like in a cage trap or a box trap. So you have restraint traps, and you have some kill traps. You also have envelopment traps, which is a type of restraining trap. You also have limb traps, which, like a foothold, which grabs the animal by a limb, or a snare. Those are typical tools to capture fur bearers. The next category of protected animals are known as game animals. These are animals that are traditionally hunted. Deer, elk, coyote, for instance, could be a game animal as well as a fur bearer because it's harvested for its fur, depending where you live. Other game animals would be some of your upland birds would be some of your game animals as well, like pheasants, grouse, some of those types of animals. So you have game animals, and waterfowl can often be under this. So there you have animals that they're protected because there are certain rules governing when you can hunt them. They have hunting seasons, as well as they have rules governing how you can take them. There may be restrictions on the type of firearms you can use, the type of ammunition that you're allowed to use. They may have other restrictions. So there are protections there. Even though you're allowed to kill them, there are rules governing how you can protect them. And then you have protected species, which would be non-game animals. And these are all the animals that they're protected in the sense that you're not allowed to kill them because there's no hunting season, there's no trapping season, and you would need a permit from the state to take that particular animal. If it was a migratory bird, you would need to have a federal permit to get the migratory to take them, and you may need a state permit to take some of those animals. Let's say woodpeckers, for instance. Woodpeckers are not hunted. They're not trapped. But there are situations where woodpeckers are causing damage, and so you can apply to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get a depredation permit. And some states will say, once you have that, you're allowed to go take that woodpecker. Otherwise, some states will say, no, you have to have an additional permit from the state to take that woodpecker as in addition to the federal permit. So it can get a little complicated here. Now, why am I going through all this type of work? Because I'm not done yet. There's still more categories to go. We haven't talked about the categories in the unprotected species yet, but I just want to take a sidebar to kind of give you a rationale for why is this important. Because what I've seen or heard of is that sometimes people who are PCOs think that they have let's say a vertebrate category or a vertebrate classification on their pesticide license. And they think that gives them the right to control wildlife as long as that animal's on the label. And that's often a misunderstanding of what the label means in that situation. Let me give you an illustration from Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, you have, like most states, you have two agencies. One is the Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife Department, and then, of course, you have the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture governs the use of pesticides within the state of Massachusetts. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, they govern the management of wildlife in the state. So just because you have a license from the Department of Agriculture, let's say it's a vertebrate pest category, and you pick up this gas cartridge, an ignitable gas cartridge that says in the label you're allowed to use this on woodchucks, doesn't mean you have the right to control woodchucks, because woodchucks are not regulated by the Department of Agriculture. They're regulated by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Which means you have to get another license. So what's confusing for people is they don't understand is that the license from the Department of Agriculture only allows them the right to use that tool, namely that pesticide. It doesn't allow them carte blanche to control that animal. That has to be decided by the Department of Fish and Game. And so this is what's confusing with people. And so what happened is because Fish and Wildlife understood that a lot of pest control operators were thinking that their license gave them permission to control these vertebrates, that they had to put a notice out and say, no, if you're going to be controlling these vertebrates outside of season on other people's ground, you are going to need to have a license from the Fish and Game Department in addition to the Department of Ag. So the Game and Fish Department would have allowed you to trap that animal. But if you wanted to use pesticide, that is when you would need the license from the Department of Agriculture. So the Department of Agriculture doesn't give you permission to control that particular animal. It gives you permission to use a specific type of tool to control that animal, namely pesticides. And so this is why it's confusing for people. As they read the label and they say, well, the label is a law, label is the law. Yes, the label is the law, but the label doesn't necessarily contain the complete law. So yes, that ignitable gas cartridge is registered and licensed to use on woodchucks, but that doesn't mean you have the authority to use it on woodchucks just because the label says it's labeled for woodchucks. You still have to have that license from your Department of Ag, which gives you the right to use pesticides on other people's land. But you may also need a license from your Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, or Fish and Game, whatever your wildlife agency in your state is, to control that particular animal, because they govern the management of wildlife in that state. Now, again, your state may be different, but if it's different, let me explain to you partly why it may be different. This is where we get into the area of the unprotected species. So let's recap. Protected species are those animals that have some sort of regulation governing when and where and how you can kill that animal. Unprotected species are animals that have no legal protections whatsoever. And here's where people get confused, because house mice and Norway rats are unprotected species. Why are they unprotected? Because they're not native to North America. They're not considered wildlife in the legal sense of the term. They may be wildlife in the biological or the scientific sense, but they're not wildlife in the legal. Remember, we're dealing with legal categories here, not scientific categories. So mice and rats are not managed by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks of your state because they're not considered native species that in need of management in your particular state. They're considered invasive species. So they do not have, for the most part, legal protections anywhere in the U.S. So therefore, when you see your pesticide, the pesticide says you can use this toxic bait to kill mice and rats. You don't need a license from your Fish, Wildlife, and Parks agency because Fish, Wildlife, and Parks doesn't manage that species. They don't have legal authority over those two animals. So therefore, the license from the Department of Ag to use pesticides would be all you need. So what are some of the categories for unprotected species? Well, again, depending where you live, you may have a category known as predators. And predators, like in our area, in Montana, for instance, predators, animals classified legally, remember, this is not a biological definition, this is a legal definition. Predators are considered animals that are not protected. Why? Because they are considered to be a threat to the livestock industry in Montana, historically speaking. Remember, laws always express the values of the time that they were enacted, okay? So in Montana, coyotes, skunks, and weasels are considered predators, and as predators, they are classified as unprotected species, so they can be killed without any license whatsoever. You can kill them with shooting, you can trap them. If your pesticide label allows you to poison them, then you can do that, providing you're following the poisoning rules. But there are no rules governing. They're basically big rats and mice is what they are treated as, legally speaking. Okay? Then you also have the unprotected birds, which I've already talked about. And then you have all other non-game wildlife that, again, have no legal protections. And this is where you have to contact your state, because different states will have different non-game wildlife that are also considered unprotected. Now, you may have heard that phrase, non-game wildlife, that I've mentioned in the protected species area, but some states will have a non-game wildlife that are unprotected. So you have to make sure you tease that out. For example, in my state of Montana, badgers, bats, ground squirrels, such as prairie dogs and Richardson ground squirrel, Columbia ground squirrel, rabbits, raccoons, red fox, those animals do not have legal protections within the state of Montana. Now, that can change, but right now, there are no legal protections for those particular animals. So if your ignitable gas cartridge says you can use this on a red fox den, you don't need to get permission from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in our state to go kill that fox, because red fox are considered non-game animals that are not protected. So I hope at least you understand. If you're a little confused, understand that it's not all in your head. It is a little confusing, but you have to be sure you understand that your Department of Ag, your pesticide license, only gives you the authority to use pesticides. It doesn't necessarily give you the right to use those pesticides on wildlife. You have to check to see if your state, because most wildlife's managed at the state level. We talked about birds. Migratory birds are controlled at the federal level. There may be additional rules at the state level, but the vast majority of animals are managed at the state level. So even though you have your pesticide license, doesn't necessarily mean you have the right to control wildlife in your state, unless that's an animal that your Fish, Wildlife, and Parks or game agency has said, we are not managing that, so therefore we're not declaring legal authority over that animal, or you don't have to come to us for a license. So, bottom line, you need to be sure you contact your state agency, your state wildlife agency, and find out. Typically, it'll be the fur bearer biologist who will have the most knowledge about this. Most people, don't just go to your game warden. Sometimes your game warden isn't going to be completely up to speed on this. You probably need to go to Fish and Wild, your fur bearer biologist, in the game, your game department in your state agency. Another place you can try to reach out to is the National Wildlife Control Operators Association and find a member within your state who you can talk to about the rules in your particular state, because they often will know them inside and out if they've been in business for any length of time. But you have to find out, because the pesticide license allows you to handle pesticides. It doesn't necessarily allow you to use those pesticides on wildlife unless the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Agency says that those animals are not protected, or they give you a license to have access to those animals. I hope that kind of cleared some things up for you, because it is complicated, but there is a way through it if you just do the time and make sure you have these terms. Is the animal protected? Is the animal unprotected? Those are the two big categories you have to work with. I hope that has helped, and I've given you some strategies to move forward so that you make sure that you're legal, because that is the minimum requirement for being a good PCO or wildlife control operator. My name is Stephen Van Tassel. I'm with Wildlife Control Consultant. Thanks for listening. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.